I'm a bit late getting to Christopher Nolan's most recent movie, Tenet, but honestly I was considering not reviewing it at all. I'm just getting started in the whole YouTube thing, and to be quite honest, everything else I have going on, I'm a bit slammed for time. In the end though, I did find it interesting to consider all the ways the film failed for me, and I think it's reflective of an overall shift in filmmaking in general, which is leading us to a world of ever more formulaic, action-based, more superficial films. So, this film is built around the idea of inverted time, or objects that have been inverted to experience the flow of time opposite normal objects. You invert a letter, send it back in time, and it reaches your 12-year-old self just at the right moment to invest in Tesla motors. One of the first introductions to this concept is when we see the protagonist firing a gun, and an inverted bullet zips out of the targeted head and slams back into the pistol. The woman helping him understand the concept helpfully advises him to not think about it, but that's something we'll get into at a later moment. Now, according to certain relativistic models of space-time, traveling back in time should actually be possible, but these models are widely thought to be paradoxical, unnecessary, and are daily crumbling beneath the onslaught of quantum physics, which seems to provide, as far as we know, a much more promising picture as to the nature of part of reality, at least. Even if time should prove to be merely an interface, a product of some deeper framework, it seems that entropy is real, more importantly randomness occurs, and time is one-directional. If it were not, the evidence seems to suggest it would be completely reversible. All things could do anything at all times, causality would cease, and everything would be this superposition of utterly unintelligible chaos. An example. 2 uranium atoms happen to decay 400 years apart. In this case, the universe is random and not deterministic in every meaningful sense. Not really true if by fighting determinism people are seeking to establish free will, but completely true if you're trying to show that things cannot function by the same laws backwards as they do forwards. So, why don't I like the time travel in Tenet? Am I just an overbearing egoist who refuses to enjoy creative concepts because they could possibly not turn out to be the way real science works? No, I love allegory, metaphor, symbolism for its own sake. That's why fantasy is my favorite genre. I also love speculative science fiction, stories that stretch the boundaries of what we know and that propose interesting concepts which, even if impossible, force us to study ourselves, to reconsider our reality, to challenge our presuppositions in interesting ways. So why not Tenet? Well, as far as I can tell, the plot must be dependent on a many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This essentially means that whenever you can possibly die and don't, for example, there's a branching in reality. You continue in yours, happily alive, and somewhere else another reality has been created in which you did die. As I mentioned in my short review, linked here, this is really supposed to happen at the quantum level, where all the laws of classical physics break down. But in this case, we use the simple possibility of dying or not dying, which could actually be dependent on quantum randomness. So, one reality where you're alive, one where you're not. So there's one reality in which Neil's not able to muster the strength to stop the goon in the elevator shaft. The mission is doomed, despite all their efforts, and the bomb goes off and humanity is destroyed. Whatever would happen to the future civilization happens, and so on. That's all well and good. Our movie just happens to follow the reality in which they did succeed. But the thing about the many branches of reality is that they cannot interact. They are different realities, not different times. The entire point of the many worlds theory is that it solves potential paradoxes, not creates them. So as far as I understand it, the idea that you can enter into a causal time loop doesn't work with this interpretation of quantum mechanics. When the protagonist goes back in time to found Tenet, he creates a new reality in which Tenet exists, running parallel to, but never contacting, his original reality, in which Tenet was never founded, the villains succeeded in blowing up the world, and everybody died. They're two parallel realities, in which two versions of the protagonist are experiencing different things, but he cannot simply multiply his consciousness in one reality, go back and fight himself, or recruit himself, or so on. But there are certain theories, again relativistic models of the universe, that allow for time loops. These are models in which the universe is a block universe and is strictly deterministic. The past, present, and future are all rigid, all equally real, and you can supposedly, with enough physics and energy, hop back to an earlier point in time. As soon as you do this, though, your actions become the past that always was, and so in going forwards, you see that the consequences of your actions were always already there. As I said, deterministic. This allows for a causal time loop only because it's deterministic. But Tenet tries to reconcile both these theories, and I don't think it works like that. Anyway, regardless of real-world physics, even accepting the framework of the movie, they clearly state that the villains of the future think they can kick Grandpa down the stairs, gouge out his eyes, and the key line, "slit his throat." I don't have the film available, but I do feel certain I heard that line, and I find it somewhat odd that many other reviewers aren't mentioning it, because it seems incredibly key. They're saying the villains think you can go from 2020 back to 1960, kill your grandfather, and still be alive in 2050. But here's the kicker. The script suggests they don't actually know. They've never tried it. This annoyed me because I myself could have solved this in a few minutes by using a chopstick to stab a friend's watermelon, going back in time, burning the chopstick, then receiving an inverted letter sent back from my friend, revealing whether the watermelon still had the hole or not. A simple experiment, 2 people and a chopstick and a watermelon, and it puts all the doubts to rest. Now maybe the villains did do this, and the filmmakers simply never thought it worth revealing. But why in all the world did the main characters not try this? It could have helped a lot. And yes, it is creatively shot, and yes, it has some spectacle-y new cinematography and imagination, but that's just it. All the spectacle was just spectacle. I simply didn't feel like it did anything new with time travel, and therefore the spectacle became an end in and of itself, which, to be honest, was how the entire film felt. It felt like a billion-dollar construction made just to convey one cool idea as spectacularly as possible. There was no emotional resonance with the characters, no new and daunting questions to grapple with, as there are in Interstellar or Inception or Batman, and I'm sure all his other films that I haven't seen. This was just more recycled time travel ideas, only shot in a crazier way and at a more breakneck pace, and with more loquacious exposition thrown in, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure was intended to help us actually follow the complexity of the concepts, or to simply hide that they were, in the end, more of the same time travel impossibility. Now, the bullet scene at the beginning assures us that, despite how little it makes sense, matter must be inverted in order to actually begin causally affecting things moving in reverse time. An inverted bullet rips through flesh before slamming into the gun that fired it, but as the protagonist displays when he wills the bullet off the table and into his hand, consciousness is universal, is all-directional, all-dimensional. He forces something to move in both his and its future with only his mind. The lady insists that causality is not broken, that either way you play the tape, he caused it, but this doesn't fit with any understanding of temporal causality we have. Consciousness in Tenet is not constrained by the same laws of causality as normal objects. This just brings in a ton of problems, even more so than your typical paradoxical time loop. So, yeah, I just didn't like it. I spent so much energy being bothered by the annoyingness of all the time stuff, and bothered by the breakneck, non-stop action, that I didn't have any spirit left to enjoy the shallow emotions, the non-existent character arcs, the breakneck pacing, and admittedly creative action of the rest of the film. Now, it should be mentioned that, accepting the premise of inversion, the political, spy, thriller-esque plot of the film was complex enough within its own right, and it was well thought through. It's not that, accepting the paradox of inversion, the movie was completely incoherent, though I actually found it more so than other time movies. It was just that the thriller spyness of it didn't present anything new. It was a fast ride and you had to think and pay attention to keep up, which might be enough for many viewers, but it was stuff which, quite honestly, just failed to strike any chord within me, whether emotional, relational, philosophical, or even pure adrenaline. The Russian villain, the nuclear doomsday clock, the non-stop and somewhat numbing action, we've just seen it all before and in a much more artistic, emotional way. It really was a shallow story, and maybe I'm just story-focused, but I really feel the action held no emotional weight whatsoever. I kept watching, hoping it could hold my attention through sheer spectacle, but my anticipation of the spectacle kept ramming constantly up against the paradoxes and garbled explanations. The rush about the globe, for example, was extremely hectic, where many films like James Bond or Mission Impossible or the Bourne series will take precious seconds of screen time to locate us, to anchor us in the setting for the next sequence of action. This one just sort of pops you in with guns already blazing. And even worse, there's not as distinct a feel between each location as there should be. I didn't really get a strong impression of distinction, whether an actual culture shown in music and color and architecture, in anything really. The scenes on the boat were often the most refreshing and pointed change of setting, simply because you can't really miss going from any of a dozen cityscapes to a yacht sitting on blue water. And I don't even really mind time travel impossibility. It's just that in my mind, good time travel movies, Looper or Primer or Somewhere in Time, ask one question, pose one theory, present one paradox with regards to time, and then they leave you with an otherwise memorable story which nicely balances the more abstract grapplings with a character-centered and emotionally rich, nuanced, resonant plot to accompany the framework of time travel. Perhaps that's the best summary in the end, and perhaps that best captures why others might rank this film highly while I do not. I'm in the end a very story-focused or character-focused guy. To me, a story is a study of all the things I find most meaningful. There can be stories heavy on the abstract, heavy on speculation, heavy on the philosophical, even heavy on comedy or art or music or dance. But in the end, the stories that I truly enjoy, without exception, have an intense focus on making us feel something for these imaginary people battling through imaginary realities towards imaginary goals. They make us ask ourselves questions about relationships, identity, about courage and truth and loyalty and sacrifice. Questions of who we are and how to be better, rather than simply so much flash and fire surrounding a concept which, though interesting, to me didn't present anything new. So that was my take. Honestly, it was frustrating to watch because I kept hoping it might get better, and while the story became a little more tightly streamlined and less confusing towards the final act, it ended up being a hollow and disappointing one. If you want to hear more of my specific complaints regarding the time travel paradoxes and all, and why I think Tenet in particular is poorly thought through, check out these videos in my Thought Experiment playlist, also linked below. Here I'll analyze specific situations in the film as well as create some hypothetical situations of my own, and try to show how, for me, the seemingly creative paradoxes of the film are more self-defeating and frustrating than anything else. As always, please consider subscribing if you enjoy content like this. That's what helps me do more of it. Thank you, and see you next time.